Good evening, everyone. So this evening we'll start with a period of meditation. And after meditation, I'll give a short Dhamma talk and then take any questions that you might have. So please start by getting in a meditation position. Sitting up nice and straight. So it's always worth taking a couple of minutes at the beginning of a meditation period to pay a lot of attention to your posture. Really make sure you're setting your body up correctly. Most aches, pains, numbness, tension, and so on can be avoided if we take the time to set up our body correctly right at the beginning. So take your time. There's no hurry. It's especially important to pay attention to how you position your sitting bones on your cushion. And also making sure that your legs are positioned in such a way that there's no pressure anywhere, which might otherwise cause your legs to fall asleep. Once you're settled into position, with your hands resting lightly in your lap, you can bring a slight smile to your face. Take a few long, slow, deep breaths. You can let your breathing return to its natural rhythm. And bring full attention to your body. Clearly feeling your body sitting here now, motionless, warm, present, tangible. So bring all attention to your body with an attitude of fascination, enthusiasm, really wanting to feel your body as completely and accurately as possible. And choose a place in your body to center the mind. So this could be your hands where they rest in your lap, or your abdomen, or anywhere that works for you. So choose a place to rest your mind and let the mind sit in that place, just as motionless as your body. So just as we hold the body still, we hold the mind still, not moving the mind in any direction, not projecting the mind towards any sensation or any thought or any experience. Letting the mind sit completely still and completely alert. and enjoying this experience of stillness of body and mind with alertness, attentiveness, stillness, attentiveness, and enjoyment. Keep strengthening these three qualities for the next period of time, focusing on the body. So this time we can pay homage to the Buddhas, and then I'll give a short Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So, I recently came across a discussion between Bhante Suddhaso and a group of other people. And one of the people was speculating about why it is that when Western people start to get interested in Buddhist practice, usually the first thing that they get interested in is mindfulness. Like, why is it that they usually seem to start with mindfulness rather than any other part of the Buddhist path? And Bhante Suddhaso's comment on this was because mindfulness is something you can incorporate into your life without actually needing to change anything that you're doing. So if you start practicing morality, well, that means you have to change how you behave. You might have to start being generous to other people. You might have to start being kind to other people. You might have to change some of your beloved habits. You might need to stop drinking alcohol or using other intoxicants. You might need to stop telling lies. You might need to stop cheating people. You might need to be faithful to your partners and so on. So all of that's very uncomfortable because you might have to stop doing what you're used to doing. You might need to change your behaviors. Similarly, right view is not particularly popular because then you have to change your beliefs. You need to change your opinions, change how you're thinking about the world, change your basic outlook on life. And that's also quite threatening. We really deeply cherish our beliefs and our opinions. In fact, we tend to have a very strong sense of self-identity connected with our viewpoints. A very strong sense of who we are, based upon what we believe the world to be and what we believe is important and what we consider to be a valuable way to spend one's life and a useful way to spend your time and so on. So right view also is quite threatening. You might actually have to change how you see the world, what you believe about the world, what you think about what's important. And he said, of course, samadhi also is quite threatening. So why is samadhi threatening? Well, once again, it requires some change in our lifestyle. Remembering that the very first component that the Buddha singles out in practicing jhana, the very first component he points to is to isolate yourself from sensuality. In Pali, it's viviccheva kamehi, so to isolate yourself from sensuality. Again, quite a threatening thing. Those who, actually the Buddha himself says that those who do not have a deep experience of the happiness that comes through Dhamma practice, so the happiness that comes through jhana practice or the happiness that comes through renunciation. Someone who doesn't have a deep experience of Dhamma happiness will naturally think that sensual happiness, sensual pleasure, is the highest form of happiness. And naturally, that's what they'll focus on. It's what they'll prioritize. So when one is approaching Buddhism, it's actually quite natural that one would be a bit intimidated by samadhi practice. If one recognizes that samadhi practice necessitates one restructure one's priorities. If one continues to prioritize sensual pleasure, then samadhi will always be extremely difficult, and it will be very challenging to get anywhere in one's samadhi practice. So you start running through the different characteristics of the Eightfold Path, and you realize that mindfulness is kind of the only thing left at this point. But this also requires a bit of a rewriting of mindfulness. If you look at how the Buddha spoke about mindfulness, so if you read the suttas, first off, recognizing that mindfulness is always presented as part of the broader path. It's not presented as a standalone practice. And even in the Satipatthana Sutta, when the Buddha is talking about mindfulness, he's emphasizing developing the perception of impermanence. He's emphasizing letting go, renunciation. He's emphasizing relinquishing self-identity. So if we take mindfulness as it's actually spoken about in the discourses centered on mindfulness, there's actually a lot of stuff in there that's also extremely threatening, because it's connected with right view, it's connected with morality, it's connected with samadhi. In fact, the Buddha mentions all of these things to one extent or another in various parts of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. So even mindfulness then needs to be chopped up and restructured a little bit, to the point where commonly these days when people use the word mindfulness, they're just talking about some kind of bland, neutral awareness. But in a Buddhist context, mindfulness always carries an ethical connotation, a moral connotation. So it's not enough just to be mindful of anger arising in the mind, and mindful of yourself fueling that anger, and mindful of yourself picking up a gun, and mindful of yourself angrily shooting a couple of people. Well, I'm sure you've got your mindfulness going, but you're not getting one step closer to awakening. In fact, you seem to be backpedaling as quickly as possible. So something is clearly missing. If we take mindfulness to just mean some kind of neutral, non-reactive awareness. Because actually in Buddhist practice, we are not trying to turn ourselves into a passive observer, but rather we're trying to actively cultivate wholesome qualities of mind that progress towards awakening. And we're actively trying to reduce and eliminate unwholesome qualities of mind that lead away from awakening. And there are ways of doing this which are more active and ways that are less active. There are ways of practicing which involve a lot of conscious, deliberate effort, and ways of practicing which are more akin to relaxing away tension. So there's different ways of applying this, but it's all built on the same basic principle that ultimately what we're trying to do is to bring about a radical restructuring of our own mind. And a radical restructuring of our own mind also necessarily involves a radical restructuring of our life, a radical restructuring of how we talk, of how we act, of how we relate to the world. And even the radical restructuring of our own mind, this needs to go all the way to the core of our mind. It can't just be a surface shuffling around. We're not just trying to shuffle around some things on the surface of the mind, because the problem of suffering is rooted all the way at the base of the mind, all the way in the center. So if you just shuffle around some things on the surface to try to make your life a little bit less painful, well, that might work. Your life might actually get slightly less painful as a result, but you won't get significant changes in the amount of pain and misery that you experience. You won't get a significant change unless you make a significant change in the structure of your own mind. And again, when we talk about mind, this is inseparable from physical action. It's inseparable from body and speech. So we talk about body, speech, and mind, but ultimately it's all mind. Body action is something you're doing with your mind. Verbal action is something you're doing with your mind. So ultimately, once again, if we're really generally interested in restructuring our mind, then it is inevitable that we're also going to restructure our actions and our speech. So then it comes down to point of motivation. What are we doing in the first place? Why are we approaching Buddhist practice in the first place? What are we trying to achieve? What's our goal? And for this, of course, we actually start with right view. There's a reason why the Noble Eightfold Path starts with right view. It's because right view is actually the foundation. So right view, what's the very first part of right view? Well, it's recognizing suffering. It's recognizing dukkha. So we look at our own mind and we recognize, I'm not really happy. I very often am experiencing some degree of discontent, dissatisfaction, some amount of confusion. Sometimes I even experience despair or anguish or depression. And even when I'm happy, it seems to be fleeting and ultimately unsatisfying, unreliable. So it starts with this recognition. It's like, oh, whatever I'm doing, so in my grand quest to be happy, whatever I'm doing is clearly not working very well. So maybe it's time to do something different. Maybe it's time to try something different. So then, once again, we come to Buddhist practice and we're like, okay, so what can I incorporate from Buddhist practice that will improve the situation, but without like actually making me change anything? Right? That would just be horrible if I actually had to change some things. So I know I'll just sprinkle a little bit of mindfulness on top of all the horrible self-torture that I do. I won't actually stop the self-torture. I'll just sprinkle a little mindfulness on top. So I'm a little more mindful as I continue with my strategy of torturing myself all the time. Yeah, good luck. So you put some sugar frosting on top of the feces cake. It doesn't change the fact that it's a feces cake. And all too often, this is, again, what happens in the early stages of exploring Buddhism. We're sprinkling a little bit of sugar on the feces and wondering why it's still not particularly tasty. And the answer is quite simple. It's because we need to radically alter our entire mind. We need to radically alter our entire life. It's all feces, all the way through, top to bottom. So as long as we try to hold on to any element of it, we're just holding on to suffering. That's all. So we want to hold on to our old habits. Well, okay. If you really want to hold on to suffering, go right ahead. That's your choice. We want to hold on to our old viewpoints and opinions. Okay, yeah. Continue holding on to suffering if that's what you want to do. Yeah, you can have that feces cake as long as you want. It's entirely your choice. Yeah, and of course we want to keep speaking the way we like to speak, doing what we like to do, behaving the way we like to behave, thinking the way we like to think. And as a result, we'll just keep on suffering. Our dukkha will not significantly diminish or shift or go away. Nonetheless, if one does sincerely begin to apply even a little bit of the Buddhist teachings, even a little bit of the Buddhist practices, then one might start to notice results. Now, the results are going to be directly proportional to the amount of sincerity and effort that we put in. And the amount of sincerity and effort we put in does also depend to some degree on right view. But if we do put forth at least a little bit of genuine effort to following the authentic teachings of the Buddha, at least a little bit, then we'll probably start to notice a little bit of improvement. And this can be the first arising of faith. the first arising of that initial glimmer of faith in the Buddha, that first little sparkle. It's like, oh, that's interesting. This stuff works. Maybe I should commit to it more thoroughly. And as we commit more thoroughly to the teachings and practices of the Buddha, then the results become increasingly palpable, increasingly tangible. And correspondingly, our faith and confidence increases even more. And then this can lead to a turning point. This can lead to a turning point where eventually we decide, okay, it's time to start restructuring my life. It's time to start changing my habits. It's time to start changing my viewpoints. It's time to let go of my old strategy, my old strategies for happiness, because clearly those weren't working. But this Buddhism stuff that I'm starting to try out, this actually does seem to bring some discernible results. Maybe it's worth it. So a radical restructuring of one's life, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean becoming a monk. Though for some people that is going to be the right option. For many people, it's not the right option now, and it may not be the right option in this lifetime even. It may not be until some future life that monastic life is going to be relevant. So radical restructuring of one's life, rather it means taking the Noble Eightfold Path seriously. Really seriously taking on right view. So this means studying the suttas, reading the suttas, all of them, cover to cover, deeply reflecting. What was the Buddha talking about? What was he teaching? What was his perspective on the world? How did he see the world? What did he think was important and true and valuable? What did he consider worth reflecting on? And shifting our own viewpoints and opinions to match the Buddha's. And the same with the transformation of the mind through right attitude, samma sankappa. So really making a sincere effort to restructure the way we're thinking about our life. So cultivating an attitude of renunciation, an attitude of harmlessness, an attitude of gentleness. Really trying to change our habits, our usual habits of acquisition, our habits of greediness, our habits of seeking happiness in possessions. So cultivating an attitude of renunciation. And trying to change our habits of grumpiness and irritability. For some of us, this is an ongoing process. But it's one which does bring tangible results. And taking on the 5 precepts. So you want to radically restructure your life, we'll start with the 5 precepts. It's incredible how powerful these can be. And yes, 5, not 4, 5 precepts. It's just amazing how many people try to argue with the 5th precept. It's like, oh, I only have 1 glass of wine in the evening every day. It's like, well, let's try 0. 0 is a much better number. How about 0 glasses of wine? And then they start making excuses. It's like, oh, the antioxidants. Oh, well, you want antioxidants, drink green tea. Green tea is great. Actually, fruit juice has just as much antioxidant power as wine, but without the intoxicating effect. So checking those excuses. What excuses are we making to reject the Buddha's teachings? What excuses are we making for not following the Buddha's instructions? We're great at coming up with excuses. Excuses to continue our strategy of self-torture rather than taking on the Buddha's strategy of happiness. Pretty strange, isn't it? That we're so deeply attached to our self-identity that we'll keep doing what we're used to doing, even if it hurts. We're so attached to our self-identity that we're unwilling to switch to another way of living that would be much more enjoyable, much more peaceful, much more pleasant, just because it's not me. But what is this me anyway? Is it solid? Are you exactly the same person now that you were 20 years ago? I'm certainly not. I'm not even close. Radically different person in many ways, countless ways. So why are we hesitant to deliberately make changes? And deliberately make changes which lead towards a genuine unconditional happiness. So we can actually take control of impermanence and use it to our benefit, recognizing that also those bad habits that we have are also impermanent, which means we can change them whenever we want. We're not stuck in those things. And yeah, you can practice samadhi. You can practice jhana. Again, I've met a lot of people over the years who are just absolutely convinced that it's impossible for them to attain jhana. It's like, no, it's not. It's not impossible to attain jhana. It just requires that you make some pretty major changes in your life, that's all. But if you make those changes, you can get jhana just like everybody else who's gotten jhana. It just requires that you be willing to make some pretty substantial changes in your life. And a lot of those changes have to do with renunciation. And this is where people say like, oh, okay, yep, I guess I'm never getting jhana. It's like, well, yeah, okay. Yeah, if you're not willing to change your life, then of course you're never going to get jhana. If you're not willing to practice renunciation, then of course your samadhi is going to be terrible. It's inevitable. It's just how causality works. If you're not willing to put the causes and conditions into place, then don't expect to get the results. It's like if you're baking a cake, well, there's causes and conditions to have a cake. You need the right ingredients, you need to put them together in the right way, you need to put them in a baking pan, you need to put them in a hot oven, you need to wait a certain amount of time. And at the end, if you do everything correctly, then you'll get a cake. And this will work pretty much exactly the same for everyone. As long as they use the right ingredients and the right conditions, then you'll get a cake. It's pretty much inevitable. But if you start getting creative with the process, like, oh, I don't really need those ingredients. That's not necessary. Oh, maybe the oven doesn't have to be hot. That's probably not necessary either. And eventually what you do is you just put an empty baking pan in a cold oven, and then you open the oven 5 seconds later and you wonder why there's no cake. It's like, well, of course there's no cake. You're not following the recipe. You're not creating the causes and conditions that are necessary for there to be cake. That's exactly the same with jhana. If you don't put the causes and conditions into place, then you're not going to get jhana. No matter how much you want it, it's simply not going to happen. So if you want good samadhi, then yeah, that's going to require a restructuring of your life. It's going to require some deep changes in how you behave, some deep changes in how you live. So, of course, there's nothing wrong with practicing mindfulness. There's nothing wrong with practicing awareness and attentiveness. In fact, these are good things. These are very wholesome things. They're elements of the Eightfold Path. But it is important to keep in mind this very important point. If you sincerely embark upon the path of Buddhist practice, you will need to completely change your life. You need to have the willingness to rebuild your mind from the ground up. The willingness to alter every single thing that you think of as me and mine. But this is not a problem, because all those elements of our self-identity are just part of our failing strategy. So our unsuccessful strategy, which hasn't been working for our entire life. So we should be joyful about restructuring our mind, joyful about changing our habits, radically altering our life. This should bring happiness to us. The joy of knowing that we're finally changing something that wasn't working in the first place. So like there's the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, I've got some news for you. Your life is broken. It's time to fix it. So this is what the Buddha's offering. The Buddha's offering a very detailed repair manual on how to fix our life. So we can finally start moving towards genuine happiness, genuine wisdom. We can finally start moving towards awakening. So to get the results, we need to apply the entire manual. We can't be selective. We can't pick and choose. You need to take on the whole package and apply it with diligence, persistence, and sincerity. So those are a few words of Dhamma this evening. At this time, if there's any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take questions and comments. So I see a number of friends have been joining in. So hello to Gita, Rick, Vidura, Kumu, Amaranta, Jayanta, Julie, Scott, Melissa, Yankee, Apple, Deborah, Louise, and Putrika. Welcome to all of you. And I don't see any questions yet. Are there any questions from the residents? No? Okay. So if there's no questions, hopefully that means that my talk was suitably clear. So that might be it for this evening. It looks like Suddha is starting to type a question. Okay, so Suddha asks, although one makes a determination to change, yet it doesn't carry out, how does one keep one's motivation? So the determination to change is the first step. Then it's necessary to actually start making genuine changes in your life. And this can be very challenging. So one of my favorite Ajahn Chah quotes, Ajahn Chah said something like, most of the practice is knowing what we should do and not doing it. So I appreciate his realistic perspective on this, because actually this is often how it feels. We know we're supposed to be kind to people, but we just can't resist making those little jabs. We can't resist a little bit of grumpiness every now and then. We know we're supposed to be generous, but no, we really don't want to give that away. No. We know we should practice more meditation, but there's so many delightful ways to waste time. So there's this commitment in the mind. There's a commitment, but that commitment is warring with our old bad habits. So keep trying. And remember the times when you've been successful, and remember how good it feels when you're successful. That helps to build up your motivation. Or look at other spiritual practitioners who are farther ahead of you on the path and draw inspiration from their example. So reminding yourself that spiritual practice is possible. Genuine transformation is possible. And realistically, if you look at your own life, you've probably made at least a little bit of progress, at least a little bit of change, which is a way of building up your confidence that it's possible to make larger changes, longer lasting changes. So keep at it. Look at, again, the progress you've made on yourself. However small it is, it's still proof that you can change. Draw inspiration from the example of others who are farther ahead of you on the path. So spiritual teachers or guides or examples that you can think of. Draw motivation from the Dhamma itself, from the purity and completeness of the Dhamma as a motivation to keep practicing. Then Rick Thorne asks, is secular mindfulness wrong mindfulness or dry mindfulness? Well, I don't actually know what secular mindfulness means. Mindfulness completely removed from a Buddhist context. Is that wrong mindfulness? Or not necessarily. Depends on what you're doing. So right mindfulness is mindfulness which leads to a reduction in one's defilements. Wrong mindfulness is mindfulness which leads to an increase in one's defilements. This is actually how it's defined in the suttas in a number of places. So for example, if you're fixating on an object of lust, something that inspires lust in you, then fixating on that object is wrong mindfulness, because it's just going to increase your defilements. So that's not a correct way of directing your mind. As for dry mindfulness, I have no idea what that means, so I can't comment. Yeah, to be honest, I'm not really interested in secular mindfulness. And to me, it's kind of like secular incense burning, secular tea drinking. It's like I drink tea and I burn incense, and for me, those are elements of my spiritual practice. But if you take them outside of a Buddhist context, they don't really mean anything and they don't lead to any genuine transformation. I know a lot of people who drink tea and burn incense, but aren't getting one step closer to awakening. At least I used to know such people. These days, I mostly only know Buddhist people, which is quite refreshing, I have to say. So if you could define what you mean exactly by secular mindfulness and dry mindfulness, then I could be more specific about whether or not it's wrong mindfulness. And Julie asks, can you speak of the social aspect? It's already a lonely path, and as we develop through mindfulness, it seems even more challenging to converse with people and coworkers. We're not vibing like most. Well, first off, I recommend having more Buddhist friends. It helps a lot. If you spend all your time with non-Buddhist people, then of course you're going to feel awkward and out of place. So make an effort to cultivate Buddhist friendships, go to Buddhist temples, go to Buddhist monasteries, connect with Dhamma channels online. There's a lot. Again, I recommend connecting to ones that are through the monastic route, so through monasteries or through monastics, as those tend to be the most orthodox. But there's also some lay channels out there which are quite authentic and genuine to the Dhamma. They're a bit harder to find because there's a lot of not so good content out there masquerading as Dhamma. So you need to have a discerning eye. It can be confusing. Yeah, it is very important to spend time at Buddhist temples and Buddhist monasteries. That will help to give you a sense of companionship in the Dhamma, which is very, very helpful. Because you're not going at it alone. Depending on which census forms you believe, there's at least 500 million Buddhists in the world. That's 500 million. That's a lot. You're not alone. As for conversing with people and coworkers, I assume by this you mean non-Buddhist people. Be friendly, be compassionate, be kind, but watch your mind and watch your speech. Be very careful that you don't take on their unwholesome ways of speaking and thinking. But still, be polite, be kind, be friendly, be respectful, be courteous, but guard your mind very carefully. Then Bobby asks, I don't know if Theravadins practice a form of fusatsu. I don't know what fusatsu is. Looks like a Japanese word, but I don't know what it means. And it says, I'm wondering, I break precepts daily while somewhat trying to uphold them. How literal should I take the precepts? 100% literal. There is no flexibility in the precepts. Follow them word by word. And don't compromise on the precepts. The 5 precepts, they're so basic, so fundamental. Like, don't compromise on the 5 precepts. There's nothing to compromise on. Like, what do you want to compromise on? It's like, well, I only kill 1 or 2 people a day. I only steal cars on Thursdays. Like, what do you want to compromise on? These are really foundational principles. Keep the 5 precepts literally. No exceptions, no compromises. So Scott says, emotional pain arises when I witness especially harsh speech and behaviors. Hopefully you're not talking about my Dhamma talks. Have you experienced this sensitivity? Yeah, actually it's deeply upsetting to see people being cruel to other people. So there's a challenge there, which is to observe the emotion that's arising in your mind, to recognize that it's arising because of causes and conditions, and to recognize that much of that is actually connected to wholesomeness. On some level, you are disapproving of the misconduct that's happening, the misconduct that you're observing. So that means your conscience is working correctly. That's good. However, it is not necessary for you to suffer because of your conscience functioning correctly. So you can recognize that one person is mistreating another, but without suffering. So protect your conscience, but don't let yourself be swept up in the sadness and anguish of that conscience, that recognition of misconduct. Bobby Perez says caffeine. So I actually don't personally know any Buddhist monk who thinks that drinking caffeine breaks the 5th precept. In fact, almost every single monk I know drinks tea or coffee, or both. And virtually every monastery and retreat center I know of allows caffeine. I only know of a couple of places in the whole world that don't allow caffeine. So they do exist, but it's very rare. So most of the Buddhist world seems to have the consensus that caffeine is not an intoxicant. So caffeine in moderate quantities is fine. So it's important to know your limits. Too much caffeine can produce a lot of agitation in the mind, which is not good for meditation practice. But it doesn't produce negligence. So the definition that Buddha gives for intoxicants is pamadatthana, which means a basis of negligence. So alcohol produces negligence, that's quite clear. Caffeine, for most people, no. Maybe for a small percentage of people it does, and for them it's better to avoid. Actually, what comes to mind is a person I knew many years ago who really should not drink coffee. Like when they would drink coffee, you could tell, like they would get very reckless and unrestrained, in their speech. So a person like that is probably better not to drink coffee. But most people, it seems harmless in small amounts. And Bobby says, making eye contact with the opposite sex for too long might be misusing my sexuality. That's not breaking the 5 precepts. That's actually a much more refined practice, which is called sense restraint. So sense restraint is part of Dhamma practice, and it's very useful, especially if you're a monastic, but even if you're not a monastic, it's very useful. But it's not part of the 5 precepts. So that's not breaking one of the precepts. So of course, staring lustfully at other people is increasing unwholesome states in your mind. So it's something you should try to do less frequently or optimally stop doing entirely. But it isn't breaking any of the 5 precepts. And RB asks, is there a Pali word for conscience? There's a few that are relevant. There's a pair of words which are most directly related to conscience, which are hiri and ottappa. And in the suttas, these 2 words are almost always used as a pair. So hiri ottappa. It's a matching set of words which basically corresponds to conscience. So the English word conscience has a fairly broad and inclusive sense. In Pali, we have these 2 separate words, hiri and ottappa, which they're bringing out slightly different nuances of conscience, but together it just means conscience. So that seems to be the end of the questions from online, and nothing from the residents. Okay. So we'll go ahead and end it this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.